Welcome back, everyone. We're back here after our lunch break. Joining us online, we have Dr. Sawani Raje Byrne. Madam is a lecturer in War Studies Education at King's College London. Her expertise lies in Indian civil military relations, South Asian security, and post colonial security studies. She holds a PhD in history and international relations from King's College London. Madam has 8 years of teaching experience and has published numerous articles and book reviews. Her experience also includes research projects and administrative roles at King's College London. We are honored to have you, ma'am, on a session on exploring the impact of strategic autonomy on foreign policy towards Viksit Bharat 2047. Welcome, ma'am, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here and be able to speak with everyone. Um, when I was asked to do this talk and when I was asked to speak about Viksit Bharat, which is what this conference is focusing on, I really started to think about what Viksit Bharat meant to me as an Indian citizen, but also particularly as an academic who works on foreign policy and South Asian security. So a little bit of background. My research expertise lies in security studies. It lies in looking at South Asian foreign policy and security policy, but particularly focusing on India. So I started to think about how the work I do and the things I think about connect with um, goals for Viksit Bharat. Now, of course, Viksit Bharat are, we all know, the stated goals for a developed India of 2047 that our Honorable Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, outlined very recently. It is a roadmap to make India completely developed by the 100th anniversary of its independence. So then, how does Viksit Bharat really connect to foreign policy or strategic autonomy? So strategic autonomy is the current watchword of the Indian foreign policy establishment. It's a stated way, a stated method, a stated approach to how India interacts with the world around it. So today I'm actually going to speak to you about how all of these concepts overlap and they relate to each other. And then I'll present some thoughts about how our foreign policy over the last decade might contribute towards fulfilling the goal of creating a truly Viksit Bharat. Today, we are all focusing on economic development, which is the core focus of the Viksit Bharat project. A lot of our speakers today also are esteemed personalities who are involved in various sectors of economic development in India and abroad. But as a foreign policy and international relations person, I want to put to you that to become completely Viksit or developed, any state, any nation needs capabilities, domestic and international capital, and legitimacy and reputation in the world it lives in. This is where what I study comes in. This is where foreign policy comes in. The way we engage with the international community or the world influences how the other nations view us, how much power we have to be movers and shakers on the world stage. And what that does is gives us more options for domestic development, for development within the state, within the country, which helps in achieving our Viksit Bharat goals. So I would actually argue that foreign policy is an extremely important component of our roadmap towards Viksit Bharat. And this Viksit Bharat, a developed India, which ends up being a very important and influential citizen of the international community. So before we go on to talk about strategic autonomy and what it is, I just want to take you back in time. I studied history. I am a historian, so I can't go for long without taking people back to a period in history. So I want to take you back to time in 1947. The external world, the world that India became independent in, was slowly being shaped by the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. The world was split into two blocks. They were at war with each other, and each bloc was headed by one superpower, America or Soviet Union. And the other weaker nations were being pushed, pressurized, incentivized, encouraged to join one or the other bloc. And what they got in return was economic aid, military help, military protection, and so on. So at this point, India emerged as an independent nation with quite a dismal economic state. Manufacturing was non-existent because of 200 plus years of British colonial rule. Agriculture as an industry wasn't sufficiently developed enough to feed our population. Our entire defense infrastructure was being split up after partition between India and Pakistan. And so when we came onto the world stage as an independent country, we were a new country with very little clout, very little power, other than the identity of being the jewel in the crown of the British Raj. And of course, we wanted to get away from that as far as possible. And so, to start with, the foreign policy India adopted at that point was one of non-alignment, which wasn't a policy of neutrality or opposition to war, but it basically said that India will refuse to join any of the two blocs that were forming in the Cold War. India argued that this was because it did not want to limit what actions it could undertake on the world stage. For example, if it joined the American bloc, it would have been dragged into any war that the US was part of. And that would have caused problems with India because it just didn't have the capacity to go fight wars other than with Pakistan. We had a lot of economic priorities, which are the key part of our internal development goals, as we all know now as well. So non-alignment became a way in which India navigated the early Cold War world with reasonable success. However, since then, a lot has changed externally as well in the world and internally within India. The Cold War has ended. The division of the world into two blocs has also ended. The US has become now the leading superpower in the world, in the international community. Some regions of the world, like the Middle East, like North Africa, have become a lot more unstable. And China, as we know, is trying to challenge the US's way of leading the international system. It's trying to make claims to becoming an alternative superpower to the US. When we look at ourselves and internally, as for India, we've become a lot more powerful, a much more prosperous nation. We have a much higher economic growth rate and a much bigger international footprint, a greater international reputation, a more powerful international reputation. And so in the last 10 years, Indian foreign policy and the way India has approached the world has tried to engage and deal with this new world order or this new design of how the world is set up, while at the same time trying to fulfill Indian goals of economic development. And this is where the term strategic autonomy comes in. Now, strategic autonomy is a term, as I said before, used to describe the spirit of current Indian foreign policy as India tries to navigate this new and quite uncertain world. In some ways, it has very few elements that are reminiscent of the time India was trying to navigate the Cold War as a new nation. Strategic autonomy as a term has been used mainly by France and India to explain their place and approach to the world. So Emmanuel Macron, who is the French president, tried to explain this concept as allied but not aligned. And on the Indian side, Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, during the Raisina dialogue in 2019, which was a very important diplomatic platform, said that India has moved on from its non-aligned past. India today is an aligned state, but based on issues. Dr. S. Jaishankar, who is our External Affairs Minister, explained this idea in considerable detail in his recent book, The India Way. If anyone is interested in knowing more about India and its position in the world and what it views itself as, I would definitely recommend this book. So Dr. Jaishankar said that strategic autonomy was essentially India being given the freedom to weigh its own interests and make its own choices. It was about being strategic, not allowing its ideological calculations to limit their actions internationally. And significantly, the idea of strategic autonomy is beyond just looking after Indian interests and what specific Indian goals are. It involves being good. It involves the core tenet of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It involves being liked by other countries in the international system. It's not just about getting respect, but creating goodwill by engaging with countries without any preconceived notions or baggage from history or ideology. And what this approach to the world would do is that it would enable India to expand its sphere of influence, to raise its profile in the world. This would also help India channel any kind of global divisions, any challenges in the international world to its own benefits. And these rewards that it gets will be invested and can be invested in its own economic development towards Viksit Bharat. So in short, we could define strategic autonomy as that is the Indian capability to make decisions independent of external pressures from the great powers like the US, especially in our main policy areas. In Dr. Jaishankar's words, this foreign policy, which is designed for an uncertain world like the one we face today, helps to advance Indian national interest by identifying and by exploiting opportunities created by global contradictions, by global rifts, by global divisions, to extract as much gains from as many ties as possible. We become friends with everyone to try and then channel all that goodwill, all that power, and all those economic and other benefits towards internal development. So now we've looked at what Viksit Bharat means. We've looked at what Indian foreign policy was like during the Cold War. And we've set out what strategic autonomy is. I'm now going to present some thoughts, some predictions on what the challenges or considerations facing India and the international world will be when we think about the next 2 decades, so until 2047. I will also talk about how this policy of strategic autonomy might be effective in helping India to deal with those challenges, eventually contributing towards making India a developed nation in line with the agenda for Viksit Bharat 2047. In effect, how should India conduct itself in this ever-evolving international system to support its ambitions of regional and eventual global leadership, along with fulfilling its Viksit Bharat goals? What are the areas of concern that the next couple of decades will throw up that might challenge India, that might be challenges India will need to overcome to fulfill its Viksit Bharat goals? So first and foremost, Indian engagement with the US. The US, as we all know, has elections coming up this year. And in all possibility, we might see Donald Trump become the next president of the United States. If that happens, the world as we know it might face a lot of challenges in the way it's organized. President Trump's last term a few years ago saw the US withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, or the US tried to renegotiate its role within NATO, which is the key American defense alliance with other Western nations. So the US was really trying to retreat from being the global leader or trying to get involved in maintaining the world as it is. So if Trump becomes the American president, we may have to see a world where American influence might reduce to an extent. American involvement in world leadership projects might take a back seat. Then how does that affect India over the next few years? Since independence, India has had quite a rocky relationship with the US until 2005 when we signed a civil nuclear deal with them. That was a turning point in India-US relations. And since then, the two countries have only gotten closer and closer. President Obama and Prime Minister Modi had a warm personal friendship. President Obama attended the Indian Republic Day Parade as a guest. President Trump and Prime Minister Modi also got along very well. And it led to our Prime Minister's historic events addressing the Indian diaspora in New York and the Howdy Modi event in Houston, in Texas, in recent years. However, Trump's election might throw this budding relationship into jeopardy in many unpredictable ways. India will need to keep up engagement in its multilateral forums with the US, which is the different alliances and different forums that India is involved in include mainly the Quad or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is India, Japan, US, and Australia. Using or having strategic autonomy, as we've discussed in this situation, might help India to navigate this uncertainty by helping it to create alliances with other states without being seen as being in the American camp, as a backup for any diplomatic arrangement that Trump might withdraw from. At the same time, the recent warmth of the Indo-US relationship might also help in insulating India from Trump's unpredictable behavior and its effect on American leadership and power in the world today. So, strategic autonomy might help us to navigate this uncertainty while also being able to fulfill our own economic sustainable development, economic inclusivity goals. Secondly, the American leadership of the international system is also likely to continue to face an increasing challenge from China over the next 2 decades. India, as we know, has long-running territorial disputes with China, and this dispute has intensified over the past few years with increased Chinese incursions into Indian territory. We've all seen the hand-to-hand combat video on the news of Indian-Chinese soldiers fighting. And so this situation might potentially make the world harder for India to navigate when China is laying claims to global leadership, to world leadership, and challenging the US, while also continuing its territorial incursions into Indian territory. However, here, the Indian policy of building goodwill towards all nations of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, while also benefiting from any rifts in the international system, which is what our foreign policy establishment, the Minister of External Affairs, sees as coming under the strategic autonomy umbrella, might actually help us deal with this volatile situation while also helping to progress towards Viksit Bharat. As we all know, the other side of the India and China border dispute is a very deep trade relationship between the two nations. This is also complicated by the power differential between the two nations, where India is seen self-admittedly, our External Affairs Minister has admitted to India being currently the weaker party in this dispute economically. China is India's main trading partner. However, strategic autonomy will help us try and overcome that weakness to really gain resources to challenge China in a significant way economically. And so India can actually use this challenge of the US and China competition to its advantage. It can leverage this competition while keeping its trade relationship intact. And thus, it will help economic development and it will help India build an international presence. For example, when recently in 2019, there were Chinese incursions into Indian territory, The US very vocally supported Indian condemnation of China and India's confrontation of it. It also provided India with real-time operational intelligence about Chinese troop movements to help India try and combat this. But in return, it asked for increased Indian engagement with the quadrilateral security dialogue. So on one hand, India did step up its engagement. It went to more meetings. It engaged more meaningfully with the quadrilateral security dialogue. However, it did not drop out or reduce its relationship and engagement with the BRICS, which is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa alliance. So it meant India wasn't committing completely to the American alliance networks. It also looked after its own self-interest and was involved in alliance networks with Russia, with China, and with South Africa and Brazil. And so it leveraged American rivalry with China to get US support in this territorial dispute, while also continuing its engagement with China in other areas. This increased its own diplomatic power and economic capital. And so over the next 2 decades, this almost tightrope walk will need to be done even more carefully, especially to strengthen our progress towards Viksit Bharat and to avoid any challenges that might jeopardize it or that might throw it into danger. We've talked about US, we've talked about China, but the third potential development would be the changing dynamics of the Middle East. We all know that currently the Middle East is an increasingly unstable environment with the war in Gaza, with operations in Libya, and in Yemen. But India is actually heavily dependent on the Middle East for its fuel needs. And with our predicted energy consumption we need for development, India is set to witness the world's biggest rise in energy demand this decade, climbing at a rate of more than 3% per year up to 2030. Oil demand from India is projected to increase to nearly 7 million barrels per day by 2030. Currently, we are 4.7 million barrels a day. And the natural gas demand is expected to reach 115 billion cubic meters per year. So if Viksit Bharat and economic development is to be achieved, India actually needs to stabilize and maintain its ties with the Middle East despite its volatility, despite changing relationships. And strategic autonomy can help in two ways, and give you an example in a second. But last year, for example, China actually brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Those two nations were not on talking terms, and China helped to restore ties. This represents a bit of a challenge for Indian involvement in the region because India is part of I2U2, which is a four-way alliance network with the US, Israel, and the UAE. But India's strategic autonomy policy allows it to build networks with other states in the region without being limited by its current alliances. So, despite Western sanctions on Iran, India has, in fact, links with Iran since 2003. It's building the Chabahar port, which is a key part of the India-Iran relationship. India also has links with Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Qatar and Israel since 2017. In terms of energy consumption, we had the Russia-Ukraine war. The West put a lot of sanctions on Russia, especially oil and gas. However, India's oil import from Russia has dramatically increased. When questioned about it, our External Affairs Minister said, "A, it's hypocrisy because the West is still buying Russian gas, but also India needs to economically develop. We cannot afford to get caught up permanently in Western politics to make our own economic development suffer. We need oil, and so we will not be constrained by permanent alliance networks and permanent alignments." And this is how strategic autonomy works. It has thus helped India build and maintain simultaneous networks with a range of states in this region. irrespective of any larger political or international undercurrents. The fourth important consideration for India in the coming decades will be the increasing strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region. Now, there have been concerns about the Chinese string of pearls policy, which essentially is India's concern that China is increasing its involvement and its influence within Southeast Asia and within India's smaller neighbors like Sri Lanka, Maldives, etc. And by doing so, it's trying to constrain and encircle India, building a string of pearls around it. And so, with concerns about this string of pearls policy, India has started its Look East policy, where it's trying to engage more with Southeast Asia. The Indo-Pacific region, which includes the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, has therefore gained importance for India. Now, what does that have to do with Viksit Bharat or strategic autonomy? In 2019, our Prime Minister Narendra Modi stressed on the idea of an inclusive Indian Pacific region, which hinted that India didn't have any problem with the inclusion of China in its Indo-Pacific strategy. The policy of strategic autonomy allows India to therefore avoid alienating China from this strategy, mainly because of two reasons. One, China is currently India's largest trading partner. And two, India depends on sea lanes for 95% of its trade by volume and 68% of its trade by value. This makes the South China Sea and Indo-Pacific extremely important if we are to continue our economic development in a stable and unthreatened way. And so, both these issues mean that Indian economic relations with China and how they are used separately to our territorial disputes are going to be key. And the policy of strategic autonomy is going to have to be used extremely carefully to ensure that India keeps getting the benefits of a peaceful Indo-Pacific extended neighborhood, despite territorial dispute with China or China's attempts to bully India. We've talked about our extended neighborhood, but coming to our immediate neighborhood, and just to add, the recent agreement that the Maldives president has made with China has made this even more crucial. More than ever, for purely economic reasons, we need stability in the area where most of our trade and ships pass through. Moving from China to our other immediate neighbor, the fifth consideration really for India in the coming decades will be Pakistan, its internal stability, and its politics. So India and Pakistan for a long time in the eyes of the West were hyphenated. They were seen together as Indo-Pak. However, in the early 2000s, and after the US-India nuclear deal especially, India and Pakistan began to get de-hyphenized. Our economic growth was growing by leaps and bounds as compared to Pakistan. Security, politics in India were stable, which was not the case in Pakistan. And that slowly meant that for the West, India and Pakistan were de-hyphenated and seen as two different entities that they had to work with differently. And so since then, the economic growth of India and its ambitions as a regional and a global leader have resulted in Pakistan being left behind, despite the near constant tensions between the two states. Whether these reduce in the coming decades remains to be seen. It's something I don't think I can predict, nor can a lot of analysts. However, it is important for India to continue the process of de-hyphenation, separating itself from Pakistan as it continues to rise towards Viksit Bharat or towards becoming a fully developed nation. A change in approach, position, and ambition, coupled with the freedom to create networks and alliances through strategic autonomy will help India progress towards this goal. The sixth consideration is quite important when considering economic development as well, and that is the climate crisis. We all know we have faced rising temperatures in the past decade. The water table is lowering minute. There's a risk of water shortage. We're facing drought, rising temperatures. At the same time, there is a risk of rising sea levels and danger for cities like Mumbai, especially. This not only affects India internally, but global warming affects India's immediate neighborhood too. Countries like Maldives, for example, are extremely concerned about being wiped off the face of this earth and what that means for their population, for their identity as a state. And that should be a consideration that is important for us with our ambitions, for Indian ambitions as a regional power in Asia. But at the same time, while the climate crisis needs to be controlled, there is a disagreement in global climate forums about expectations to curb emissions from developing countries. India and China argue that the West tries to unfairly impose curbs on them that might stunt the development. The West, it argues, has industrialized. It has spent the past 200-300 years not worrying about the climate crisis, about emissions, about curbing those emissions, and economically developed, and is now expecting developing countries to play by its rule book. This is a very valid argument. If we are to become fully developed, fully economically developed, to invest in our manufacturing sector, to attain the goals of Viksit Bharat in 2047, which, by the way, do include sustainable development, there needs to be some sense of pushback on curbing emissions in a way that is economically harmful. At this juncture, strategic autonomy, again, has the potential to give India space to build issue-based alliances, as our Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale said. In this instance, the issue is climate change. India has the potential to ally with with states it might be politically opposed to on this particular issue to try and lobby global climate forums to allow a sense of economic development to happen, or an approach where economic development is not completely harmed by working towards climate change. Don't get me wrong, I think it's important and it's a very, very key issue that we all work towards sustainable development. But there needs to be a realistic assessment of what developing nations can do. And so these kinds of agreements will focus on problem solving for states that will actually bear the economic and social brunt of climate change. If the sea level rises, if climate crisis gets worse, it is India, it is Bangladesh, it is the Maldives, it is Sri Lanka that are going to be facing the brunt of it, that are going to have people going without water, that are going to have cities underwater. And so a global blame game doesn't really help anyone. And this balancing of economic development and measures to combat climate change is a tightrope walk that India needs to consider carefully. Now, and climate change, I think, is a much bigger challenge than just Viksit Bharat until 2047. It has a potential to really shape India's ambitions on the global stage beyond 2047. And that really brings me to Indian ambitions beyond the 100 years of independence. We have talked about Viksit Bharat as a stated goal until 2047, but actual Indian ambitions beyond that are to be an emerging global superpower. And what does that mean? It means building trust within the international system. It means undertaking moral leadership within the international system and trying to get social capital to build itself up as a global leader. And this is where what Dr. Jaishankar says is very, very important. While strategic autonomy is important in trying to build relationships with whoever we want, there is a need to focus on building goodwill beyond self-interest as well. It involves making difficult decisions about what India represents on the world stage, what we would like to mean, what our legacy would want to be beyond 2047. And so, to sum up, thinking about what strategic autonomy brings to the table with regard to Viksit Bharat, it is twofold. One, it will help combat challenges that will arise in the next 2 decades, definitely. But if our long-term aspirations for global leadership, for a superpower status, are to be looked at, we will need to evaluate how much trust and stability for India in the international system will strategic autonomy build? What, at the end of it, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas are in their core collaborative principles. And so when we think of India in the next 2 decades, over the next 100 years, true strategic autonomy will mean really being able to change from a middle power seeking to gain more capital, more power for economic development, to becoming a global superpower that uses the economic power and development it has to do good in the world. Thank you.
With that insightful session in mind, let's open the floor to questions. Please feel free to ask.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Rahul. So I had a question where the question was, how will India's participation in the global biofuel alliance impact its reliance on the Middle Eastern oil imports, as you highlighted in the speaking about?
Sorry, I was
Ma'am,
muted. Yeah. Um, so I think it's a very important question because one of India's big dilemmas at this moment is to try and increase its profile in forums like the G20 without really compromising on its economic development. I think India has diplomatically and symbolically done the right thing in launching it at the summit here. I think realistically, in the short term, India's reliance on Middle Eastern oil cannot be reduced. However, I think I look at the Global Biofuel Alliance as a long-term alliance. It's about research. It gives you an opportunity to research biofuels. It gives us an opportunity to really work on sustainable development in a fundamental manner. And I think what strategic autonomy allows us to do is to have both happening hand in hand. It allows India to say our dependence on oil in the Middle East is short term because we will need to develop. And the reason we need to develop is so we can invest more in finding sustainable solutions for biofuels, for the problem of energy that the world is facing. So I think in the short term, I don't see that changing our reliance on oil. However, with the diplomatic narrative that India is putting forward, I can see that this Global Biofuel Alliance will be seen as something that India can contribute to as a long-term solution for its world leadership.
Hello, madam. I'm Abhijit Shone. I'm faculty here. So you said in the beginning that there was a Cold War between India and sorry US and Russia. And what I feel, I am not an expert, but the today also it is going on. Like the Ukraine Russia war is going on. Is it the same thing? Like, and again we need to use this strategic what you said autonomy to balance it, right? And the government is doing this. At one view on this. Second point is India-Pakistan relationship, right? And this tension cannot be normalized. What I feel as a common man, at being strengthening our defense, is it the only solution for that? And having better ties with China because we can't fight with China.
Thank you. I think the first point is absolutely spot on. In fact, I cut out a section on how this is a new Cold War um, because of time constraints. But that is a really perfect assessment because what we see now is the effectively the West is trying to isolate Russia, imposing sanctions, and Russia and trying to build up NATO, trying to expand NATO. Um, there's talks about Ukraine whether it wants to join NATO when the war was beginning, and this is very reminiscent of the early Cold War. So, in that sense, I think, sir, you're absolutely right. This hasn't changed. We are looking at the new Cold War, um, and much like non-alignment, strategic autonomy has a lot of potential to help us navigate this because we need the US. We need to be on good terms with the West, but we can't not be on good terms with Russia, not least because um, traditionally we have used Russian defense equipment. All of the MiGs are all old Soviet Union, now Russia, and we're involved in Russia in a lot of diplomatic forums. So it is definitely true. It's a completely similar situation. And I think the key because we are not, India currently is not very engaged with the non aligned movement, which now has 120 states. But I think strategic autonomy will have to make us think about how we can navigate this. As a state with considerable power, India is a power center and a center of influence within South Asia um, that the West also needs. So I think the next steps for us and the next concern for us will be how if this Cold War turns hot and there are proxy wars, there are um, the US and Russia actually end up fighting in different places, what would India do? And the question about Pakistan, I think it's in everyone's interests, India and Pakistani interest, and in the interest of the world to reduce tensions. When Kargil was happening, for example, there was a lot of talk about potential use of nuclear weapons, and that really worried the world in general. So India and Pakistan is always seen as volatile, and I think might be avenues for discussion for development. Under Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh's early years, there were talks, quite productive talks between India and Pakistan. Hotlines were created. However, it needs an incentive from both sides. I think it needs political motivation from Pakistan as well, and from India. And the catch 22 for us right now is not being seen as weak because we are the stronger neighbor at this point, and we have China to contend with. And so it really falls on how Pakistan, what are the next steps Pakistan takes, whether it pushes India to stop talks again, or whether both nations find a common interest. Because I agree, I think China is the real threat for us at this point, and is more powerful.
Thank you, madam. Only one point, one more point related to Pakistan, China, India. This because in the interest of India, right, democracy is important for us, but we can't control Pakistani army, right? So can we find a solution through US controlling the army of? and through Russia, because they are destabilizing the entire region actually.
I think that is a fair point. I mean, Afghanistan makes things slightly more difficult, um, because Pakistan is no longer, in very real terms, important to the US now that the US presence in Afghanistan has ended. Until the US was in Afghanistan, Pakistan was important for the US to try and keep their influence on, to try and ensure stability. Now that the US has withdrawn and Taliban is in Afghanistan, the US has basically tried to withdraw from its influence in Pakistan. The Cynically, the real way to try and engage US or Russia into talks with Pakistan is to convince them that influence in Pakistan matters. Um, Democracy in Pakistan has always been unstable, and that's the key problem, because no talks can happen until there is stability on both sides. Um, and so I think that we are actually facing a bit of a problem now, um, in trying to convince the superpowers to really invest their energy, their time, their resources into stabilizing Pakistan when they have no incentive to do so.
Hello. Yeah, Savni, this is Professor Shetty from IMDR. It is a question which has two parts. First thing, we are trying to develop relations with various regions, but our neighborhood itself considers India to be a big bully. You look
Yeah.
at Maldives, you look at Sri Lanka, Nepal. So how do we handle this situation? And the second part is, do you think the economic instability with our neighbors would affect our goal of Viksit Bharat?
Thank you. I mean, it's really interesting because I've been thinking about it since the Maldives agreement was signed with China. Um, I think, I mean, as you all know, in the 90s with Gujarat Doctrine, we sort of started this idea of engaging with our neighborhood in a more benevolent manner without asking for anything in return. A bit like, I always see it as a bit like the US does with South America, being trying to be the sort of big brother neighbor. Um, I think we could do that, but now we are going to have to tread carefully with that. I do see it as a challenge, to be honest, because with String of Pearls, with Chinese Belt and Road, and especially Chinese focus on the Indo-Pacific, um, India really needs to co-opt its smaller neighbors diplomatically in a way that um, shows a sense of equality and reciprocity, which is hard to do because we are more powerful and more prosperous than them, and so in a way, it's hard not to get involved without that power differential. Um, I feel like it's key where we can engage the West or other alliances in this. So, for example, creation of regional networks, regional organizations that involve India, its smaller neighbors, and say the US, the UK, Australia, um, other countries really might help it give a sense of equality or reassurance to our smaller neighbors that it's not that India is asking them to choose India or China and trying to co-opt them into its strategic goals. So maybe that's the way forward, but it is definitely a challenge. Um, and with economic instability, yes, I mean Sri Lanka is a huge case study, but I mean whether it's political instability, military or economic, we can't really escape our neighborhood, and that is the truth and the reality of it. Again, not to go on about strategic autonomy, but this will really help the building goodwill aspect of it, because I think there is an opportunity to really sit and think about what it means to build goodwill, whether it means just providing aid or it actually means engaging meaningfully with our neighborhood in a way that might be different from the way we have done since the 90s. So I think this is really a moment for us to sit back and think about a what do we want ourselves to be seen as, not just for Viksit Bharat, but as I said, for the next 100 years maybe, and B, what does it mean to say Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas? What does it mean to say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam? And really, I think Maldives is a wake-up call to really see that, China is not sitting idle. Um, and we need to maybe think about it in a more pragmatic manner.
Hello, ma'am. My name is Pratik Poddar. I'm an assistant professor here. So, while we think about the ultimate vision of Viksit Bharat, do you think the US deep state will partner with us or will go against us?
Oh, that's a really hard question. Can I ask you what you mean by the US deep state? Um,
Ma'am, elements more in the capitalistic state, non-state actors who have always had a very important role in framing of policy decisions.
yeah. Okay, thank you. I think this is the difficulty in the world today about the problem with looking at the world through a state-centric approach is that we often don't consider non-state actors, which are massive influences in the way states interact with each other. Uh, Sorry, an example is social media companies. Um, they are huge non-state actors where states are essentially trying to play catch up with trying to create a legal framework to control them. However, they influence everything from elections to information, propaganda, not just in within a particular state, but in other states. So we've seen Russia in the US election and what that has done. To come back to the US, um, non-state lobbies are a huge part. However, I think India has diaspora, which is a big soft power tool, um, which over the past 10 years we have started to mobilize. So when I talked about Howdy Modi or Modi's Prime Minister's rally in Madison Square Gardens in New York, there has been an effort to try and use the Indian community abroad to our foreign policy advantage as diplomatic tools. And so I think when we think about Viksit Bharat and how the US will react to it, um, what will be important to consider is we have this really powerful, wealthy lobby, not just in terms of financial wealth, but social capital, social standing, cultural capital, um, that we can use over the next 2 decades to shape our narrative of how we want US to be involved within Viksit Bharat.
Hello, Sawani. It's Professor Suraj here from IMDR.
So
My question is a bit different, and again, it might be confusing to you also, because that's what happening in my mind. Uh, we as a country, we are truly democratic by its true sense. And because of its democracy, there were two words which were talked a lot, freedom of speech and speech freedom. Correct. And now we look at domestic politics, and then we have national politics, and then we need to deal with international politics. So now my question is that is the current condition of India, which was not 10 years down the line, we are growing fast and the world is looking at us in a different way. Is it associated to a leadership of a particular political party? Or is it associated to the current economic conditions, which are not good at outside? Or it is really a country as India that we are growing? Or it's just a bubble economy? These are certain things which are no there in my
mhm.
mind and which are always confusing to me. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm not an economist, so my answer will be very much a foreign policy answer.
Yes, yes.
Um,
I'm looking for that only.
so I think the way I look at foreign policy is any country's situation at any point in time is a combination of its external factors, its historical legacy, which is huge because that is tied in with its reputation, with its current leadership, and with economic growth. Um, Having said all of that, I think any kind of economic growth or rise or reputational rise is a cycle, and it's incredibly gradual. And I think um, all the factors you mentioned do play a big role, but I think it's since the 90s. I sort of always look back to the 90s as a key moment in the changing of India and its engagement with the world. So I think since the 90s, the past 3 decades now, we have slowly and surely, step by step, managed to get to where we are in terms of our growth, our international engagement, everything else. And the external environment has helped us to a lot of extent. Internal environment does change as well, and that helps. So I think the current moment we see is a product of, I would say, the last 70 years, but particularly the last 30 years, and a combination of these factors.
We can take one last question.
I'm Dr. Shweta from IMDR faculty.
Hello.
My question is, they say that interdependence brings global cooperation. But then on the another side, we are talking about the strategic autonomy. And we had seen in the past also, it's China or Russia. They were independent, they were strong, and they were manufacturing everything. And that had created actually the problem that there is a monopoly. So do you think that when India talk about the strategic autonomy, is it going to affect our international relations?
Thank you. That's really that's a really important point, because I think with strategic autonomy, the way it has been framed, and I think, in my opinion, needs to really be highlighted, is that it really is not just about Indian interests. It's about how India forms networks internationally to fulfill its interests. And I think when that happens, the creation of goodwill, the creation of being friends with everyone, the independence to be friends with everyone, is what strategic autonomy is. So the conversely, I think over the next, at least for the next 20 years, strategic autonomy will give us space to exert that power, so we can engage with the US and with Russia, even if they are engaged in a Cold War. We can continue our trade relations with China while having a territorial dispute with them. So it's very issue based. Where I think what you say really matters is our long term view of what we want to be known as. If we really want global leadership, and we are in the beginning of that journey, we are not really far along, but if we really do want global leadership, then I think there will need to be a point to sit and think about how strategic autonomy can be molded, and the freedom we've got can be changed, how the narrative about it can be shaped to position India as a global leader that includes everyone, rather than a self-interested actor that does what it wants for its interest. So I think that's where the real change and the real thinking will have to happen.
Okay. Hello, ma'am. This is Sawani here. So, ma'am, my question is, as the world is very curious about India, so could you just highlight some points of how cultural diplomacy could be one of the tools wherein, we can attain the Viksit Bharat vision of 2047?
Yeah, cultural diplomacy is huge, and I think we are particularly at this moment really using our cultural diplomacy very, very well. Everyone knows about things like International Yoga Day, right? That's something that is being widely talked about. But I think cultural diplomacy goes beyond that. I think using the diaspora, as I said, to create and craft an image of India that we want to create will be key, will be important. Using cultural diplomacy in terms of, I mean, things like our film industry are huge sources of soft power and cultural diplomacy. How the world sees us and the engagement is there. Sport, I think, will be really, really key in how we engage with the world. And I think the sort of underlying position is, I think we will, if we really want to fulfill the Viksit Bharat vision, as an inclusive economic vision, I think inclusivity and sort of wide participation in all of these facets of whether it's sport, whether it's cinema, whether it's yoga, need to really be focused on, and are areas where we can put in a lot of cultural capital to create a narrative about India. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to the audience for such an engaging question and answer round. On behalf of IMDR, I would like to thank you, ma'am, for such an enriching session. I would like to quickly summarize some of the points that you mentioned in your session. First of all, ma'am, as you rightly highlighted, the current relationship of India with America, and also mentioned the impact on that relationship with the much anticipated Donald Trump winning the elections, followed by India's relation with its neighbor countries and how that can impact Viksit Bharat, and also the current position of India in its global landscape, current global landscape, as well as you highlighted climate climate changes and concept of sustainability for Viksit Bharat. Ma'am, it was truly an enlightening session, and you have inspired us all and helped us understand the impact of strategic autonomy on foreign policy towards Viksit Bharat at 2047. I would like to thank you, ma'am, for that.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the questions as well. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.